it's an ideal, and I don't think in practice is actually achievable.
That was the voice of North Central College's resident media critic and historian.
My name is Steve Masick. I'm the chair of the Department of Communication and Media Studies at North Central College.
For a better understanding of objectivity in media, we're going to get up a couple of perspectives. Here's Steve's.
When people talk about objectivity in news or in journalism, what they typically mean is that the reports are factually accurate, right? That the reporter who's written it or covered the story is presenting readers or viewers or listeners just with the facts and not coloring the facts with their own interpretations, their own values, or their own opinions. So it's premised on a distinction between the facts and opinions. That the report is balanced. That is, it's that it shows all sides of a controversy. That it's nonpartisan, and so that a reporter is not supporting a particular political or ideological point of view and not twisting facts towards that point of view. And I think that, in that conception of objectivity, that it be fact-based, that it be nonpartisan, that it be balanced, and that it be kind of independent of any interested party, is a good ideal, right, for journalists to have. I mean, I don't think that democracy would flourish if the steady diet of news and information that we depend on, right, to make decisions about which candidates to elect, which policies to support, and so forth, was consistently being tainted by non-objective information, right? That if all the information we got was sort of biased or slanted, it would be hard, right, to come to political decisions.
This is Bob Tomaszewski, an NCC alum and a reporter at Sauk Valley Media, with his take on objectivity.
I found that was helpful to know, like, who am I inherently biased against white supremacists, things like that. If I have to write about them, is that going to be fair? But I found it's a little bit more complex than that. It's more about the information you provide and what's left out and what is left in.
Now we'll hear from Steve about the direction in which the media slants.
I do think there is a particular slant to the news media, and I think it could be described exactly as Noam Chomsky and Ed Herman describe it in Manufacturing Consent and in their description of the propaganda model of the media as a pro-establishment slant.
Bob, in a roundabout way, describes how the propaganda model works.
I thought a car accident was newsworthy. My boss would come up to me and say, did anybody die? No. Did anybody, was the car on fire? No. Then I don't care. So there's sort of this bias of even what is news.
The propaganda model is the meat and bones of Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman's Manufacturing Consent. It's pretty complicated, but it breaks down pretty close to this. There's 5 filters. The first one is ownership. Who owns the media company? Who's making editorial decisions? Second is advertising. Because media is advertising based, it is there for profit. They have advertisers, and they kind of don't want to have stories about them, so it introduces another form of bias. Third is sources, in which where the media outlet or where the reporters find information, where they get their sources, has a bias because those sources might not want to give all the information or might not be able to give all that information. Fourth is flag, which is just facing criticism about what you're reporting. And last is, this came out in the 80s, so they went with an anti-communist ideology where you do not do anything communist, you are not red, you stay true to capitalism.
Even if the individual story is factually accurate, it's nonpartisan, it doesn't favor one side of a controversy over another, it's nonpartisan, doesn't favor one political party or another, it's balanced, it doesn't favor one side of a controversy or another. Nevertheless, it still could not be objective in the larger sense because somebody had to make a judgment that this story is more valuable to cover than another.
To understand media now, it's important to understand the history. So for that, we're going to go back to Steve.
In the 1900s, 19-teens, 1920s, most of our newspapers were openly partisan. You could tell somebody's political orientation by what newspaper they read.
Yeah, you heard that right. Openly partisan.
So, for example, in the city of Chicago, the Chicago Tribune was a stalwart Republican paper, and they actually were somewhat sympathetic to fascism. Same is true of the Hearst papers. We had a couple of William Randolph Hearst papers in Chicago. The Hearst, William Randolph Hearst notoriously was very sympathetic to Benito Mussolini and to Italian fascism. On the other hand, you had a paper like the Chicago Daily Times, which was the forerunner of the Chicago Sun-Times, which was a staunch New Deal paper and a cheerleader for labor unions.
Steve points to a couple of key aspects which helped change the open partisanship nature of newspapers.
1940s, 1950s, you had consolidation of the newspaper industry, of the news industry, and you had fewer and fewer owners owning more and more of the press. And one of the things that happened was papers that were kind of openly partisan, or news outlets that were kind of openly right-wing or left-wing, started to lose advertising to papers that presented themselves as being politically neutral. And one of the other things that happened was you had the growth of journalism schools. You had more journalists being trained in journalistic ethics, in college courses, and more papers were hiring journalists who had been trained in college courses, and trained in journalistic ethics. And so what you had was kind of this kind of development in this faith in a faith in objectivity.
My role as a journalist is to get as much information about a topic about a story or a topic as I can, and present that to the public, and sort of and sort of have it be so that the reader doesn't wonder anything, but at the same time they're able to decide for themselves how they feel about it.
I think regulations, changes in government regulation of media does play a role, and the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine, which was just an FCC, it was not an official government policy, it was an internal FCC policy that sort of mandated that that any time a broadcaster was covering a controversial issue, that they would air both sides, right, of the issue, that they cover the issue with some fundamental fairness. Owners of AM radio stations had lost their dominant genre of programming, music, so they they had to resort to if you want to kind of fill up your schedule, a really cheap way to do that is to hire some really opinionated blowhard, put a microphone in front of them, and let them talk for a couple of hours.
On January 26th, we had a officer-involved shooting. I left out this guy's criminal history, but I did say that he was a habitual traffic offender. And people are saying I said too much. And then, of course, the police, there's people on the other side who say, hey, you should have put in his criminal history.
Bob had an interesting run-in concerning objectivity on a story he recently did.
I covered Jim Martyr. He's a candidate for the 16th Congressional District. I don't agree with his politics, but I tried to give him a fair shot for a town hall he held in Dixon. And then looking back over my work, I realized that maybe I was a little bit too fair with him, because I forgot to mention any of the other candidates running in the race. I was so focused on being fair towards him.
We'll hear from Bob on his thoughts about the landscape of newspapers and media right now.
Online media is helping spread news. I'm just not sure if it's helping newspapers stay afloat. The big problem being not wanting to include information, or being understaffed and then excluding information that way and being seen as biased. because we don't have the staff to cover this, we don't have the staff to cover that, and then people accuse you of, oh, you're biased against that. That's a really, for a news network or a newspaper, small, that's really hard. And then just trying to find out what's the right amount of information, relevant information to make people care about something.
Now we're going to hear from Steve.
And so from the 50s through to the 1980s, most newspaper editors, most reporters kind of understood themselves as being devoted to objectivity and as striving for objectivity in journalism. And I think that that was true even to the end of the decade. What's sort of changed is we've had kind of the fragmentation of the media audience thanks to technological innovations like the rise of cable, which allowed for niche television networks. The rise of talk radio on AM radio, which is a sort of similar thing in radio, and of course the rise of the internet, which has allowed for niche publications, online publications of various kinds that cater to people's very particular interests, that has allowed for the re-emergence of openly partisan news organizations.
Now we hear from Bob about what he thinks the future of media is going to look like.
As people hone in on their markets, it might get a little bit more, subjective. This is what people care about. This is what so-and-so cares about. It's like Spotify with your preferences a little bit. I have a fear of that becoming the case with news and catering and a little bit too much.
My claim for this video was that reporters have to find a proper balance between objectivity and bias because our culture is so polarized. And I left the term reporter vague for a reason. I could have went print reporter, broadcast reporter, but I left it as reporter. Because to me, everybody is a reporter. Comedians are reporters, they report on life. I'm a reporter. Everybody watching this is a reporter. And that means that we all have to find a proper balance between objectivity and bias. It doesn't matter if our job is to write in a newspaper or for a magazine or if we're a TV anchor or a radio host. Because the way we handle our bias will reflect back into the media that we consume. Because we've heard a lot about supply side bias from the propaganda model. There's also demand side bias coming from the market, coming from us. And if that happens, our biases reflect back into the media, and it's only going to fuel our biases, and it's not going to create any difference. It won't create any change. So I'm going to leave you with a call to action. Read the spectrum. Find publications that you don't agree with and read them. And then find publications you do agree with and read them directly after to make you feel a little bit better. Go right from The Nation, a hard left-wing news publication, over to the National Review, a conservative one. It might not feel great, but you're going to understand things at a different level, and you are going to be fighting bias. And that's what we're here to do, because having a faith in objectivity hasn't left.
One paper in and of itself is going to be geared a little bit in this direction. One paper in and of itself is going to be geared a little bit in the other direction, and it's a matter of not just reading one thing, but reading a spectrum in order to get the full picture.